So we're in our summer series of lessons. I don't know if we've pointed this out, but now that we're in the season after the holiday of Pentecost, we are progressing in three ways through our scriptural texts. So we're reading the Patriarch Saga for our Old Testament lessons. And we started out with we started out with the creation on Trinity Sunday. And then we have continued with the story of Abraham. And finally, Abraham's son Isaac has been born. And we today find out continuing of that story. We'll find out more about Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, as the Sundays go along and into the Joseph saga. And so this connected bit through the summer is intended to give us an understanding of that part of Scripture which relates God's first choice of a chosen family, a family with whom to work and with whom His will can be shown to the rest of the world. We're also, for the first part of this season, reading through Paul's letter to the Romans, that longest of Paul's letters, and filled with lots of things to try to wrap your head around. And so I commiserate with anyone who is making a deep effort to figure out everything Paul is talking about, and we'll get more to that later. And then for our gospel readings, we are reading through Matthew chapter 10 at the present time, a series of lessons in which the disciples are addressed, and we can talk about methodology, and will here in a moment. So today we might say to ourselves, these are some of the worrisome texts, the difficult ones. We have this story of giving up your child, your only child, after all this effort to bargain with God, and then be, sounds like, threatened with utter disaster. And our psalm today, written from the heart of the exile, is not a happy psalm. So, how do we deal with these texts? And I know some of the commentators have talked about, the Hebrews were in trouble and they had rather a dark view of the world and therefore of God. And so the Old Testament, that's all about violence. And then finally Jesus comes and, which is not how it works. God is God forever and ever. And it's how we approach the text, how our hearts are moved by the text, that's key to our being able to learn from them and try to follow in our tradition the call of service to God. So last week we had the Hagar and Ishmael story. And so Abraham finally has a son, but Sarah, the real wife, says, I don't want her around and I don't want her son around. So off to the desert they go. End of story is that God saves them, and that in fact Ishmael becomes the patriarch of a whole another part of God's kingdom. And so we don't get that story in the rest of the text. As it turns out, Isaac is spared, and we don't hear a lot about Isaac. It's Jacob, the grandson, who gets most of the play, and then Joseph later on. But the question is, for Abraham, here after all this time, these ages gone by, is he to lose both his sons, both the promised progeny of his existence? Everything is up for grabs in these two stories from last week and this week. For us, we have to say, well, what kind of a God says, gives it all and then takes it back? Not only takes it back, but puts Abraham as the one who has to go make the sacrifice. This just seems such a grisly story. And we have some modern iterations of the story of the mom throwing the kids off the skyscraper in Salt Lake because God told her to do so. And that's not it. That's not what the story is about. Ultimately, of course, where is our faith? What is it we are willing to put our trust in? Do we wrap it up all in our children? And I know we do that. But here on this holiday, the 4th of July, can we think about the children that we have sacrificed and we have taken to that altar in the mountain, on the altar of war or the altar of freedom? And they've gone willingly, and they've gone with hope and bravery. But again, our lives and our ultimate things that we put our faith in are more than just our continued existence. As it turns out, of course, Isaac is spared. We might wonder, did Abraham know that all along? So lots of interest. This is a classic story worthy of hours of discussion. And it's a story that both Jewish and Islam and Christian tradition have great texts trying to come to terms with this story. But the final thing, do we look at this glass half full or half empty? When we approach the story, Isaac is spared. Isaac was always going to be spared. Abraham's faith was strengthened. It wasn't just about getting rewards from God that Abraham followed God. Abraham left Haran, and it was reckoned as righteousness. Abraham didn't know if he was going to get anything, but he followed where he was led. And so the lesson again here is we need to follow God's true call. And discern that, of course, but God calls, we follow. And of course the Psalm's voice out of the depths of exile, all is lost. How many Psalms have a theme such as this theme? Can you imagine God's people being uprooted? All the wealthy people, the leadership, the ones who had built up Israel, the temple, etc., off they went into exile. And all that were left were those who really didn't have much. And then they were turned into slaves for the occupying powers. And yet, Israel has survived to this day. And in the end of the psalm, I will sing to the Lord. When people from the diocese have gone over to Kenya, there was a particular community with whom the diocese was working to provide a water supply. And so over several years, groups would go especially from Boise. And they were always amazed to, fly in, get herded onto the bus, go out to the middle of nowhere, and be greeted by this community, people from the community, who hadn't had clean water, who struggled to survive, and yet as they stepped off the bus, there was this loud clapping and singing, smiles, people dressed up in their best, true joy. This was God at work with the feeling of thankfulness to just be here and be alive from these people who had nothing. And so those from Boise who had, shall we say, everything, were always taken aback at the first to think about, when do we ever have this utter feeling of exuberant joy in our Creator and in our being? We accept clean water as just what we expect to have. Israel's people never lost hope. So again, what's the ultimate lesson? Trust in God, follow in God, God will provide. And then we have the wages of sin is death. I suppose David, Liz, remember that sign on the Oregon side? Right up there as you always went by it. The wages of sin is death. Of course, for us, it occasioned a grammar lesson, not so much as a theological dispute, but focusing on our falling short of what God has created us to be. So, we're headed to hell. Watch out. Is that what Paul's all about? Another negativity? Look at the context. Paul is writing this letter called Romans, and it's not necessarily to Rome, but from Rome. It's written to probably people who have not had a religious tradition, people outside of faith in God, people who followed their own wants and desires, who had no direction, people whose lives were essentially empty. And so, to what were they enslaved? They were enslaved to sin. They were enslaved to their base desires, not knowing any better. And so, at the end of the day, where was their faith? What did they believe in? What did they count as a blessing? Getting through another day, perhaps? Having a meal to eat, some pleasure? Not the overarching context of being part of a great creation that is made good, a calling that Jesus has given them to be part of God's progress in the world. So for us, well, what things are we slave to? Where do our impulses lead us? And yes, they can lead us to the death of hope, of faith, of joy. We live in a lovely place where our needs are generally well taken care of. The ultimate need of a full spirit, however, is something that we do struggle with. So the disciples, to the gospel lesson this week. And again, the disciples have been sent out. They were named in our first reading a couple of weeks ago. And then last week, that fear and discord. You're going out like sheep to the wolves, so watch out. And your message is going to tear families apart. So hardly something that the CEO might want to tell his sales representatives, you're going to go out and you may not come back, and what you're going to sell is going to really make people angry. Maybe I wouldn't want to work for that company. But this is the disciples' charge. Now, this week, we come a little more to the methodology. There's this positive note. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever welcomes you welcomes Jesus. Whoever welcomes Jesus welcomes the true and living God. And so there's this pathway to salvation, really, that is being offered. Their message, it may cause discord, but their ultimate message, the final faith statement, is going to bring true salvation to those who will listen. So, a positive note, a friend of yours is a friend of mine. We might today talk about the 6 degrees of separation. So, I give the message to you, you give the message to someone else, and within 6 iterations of the message, it's out in the whole world. Is that how this 6 degrees of separation works? This has been scientifically studied, and now with modern technology, the 8-year decrease in degrees of separation has gone from 5.28 all the way down to 3.57 degrees of separation in 2016. So know that your efforts will bear fruit. This theme is repeated a lot in the Gospels. Matthew says it probably 6 or 8 times. And in all the other Gospels, there's something similar to this theme of, if you are welcomed, your message, your person, your attitude, your charisma, if you're welcomed, what is being welcomed is God through Jesus and the gospel. So, we want to pay it forward. God's good world has gifted us with good things. And to pay it forward, we don't just go back, we do something further on. And again, our attitude is that this will bear fruit throughout the whole world. And that is the ultimate call for Matthew as well. How do we end our lesson? What is our ultimate thing we have to do? How about that cup of cold water here in July? Even a cup of cold water stands as a symbol of God's grace in the world and your part in the ministry to all of creation. And so, of course, we've done that. St. Luke's had his little bottles of water that it handed out at the 4th of July celebration. Weren't we forward thinking? That was a wonderful sacramental gift to the community. And today we can thank, I just received from my Palestinian connection stories of life in the camps, and issues of life are down to bare earth. Issues of a cold cup of water are the things that mean everything to people who are still struggling to have the basics of life. So yes, we do worry about the future. Our lives are consumed with looking forward and thinking, if we keep going this way or that way, what might happen? Our lessons today, however, are saying where we're headed is within God's ministry of creating the kingdom of God's perfection. And so, yeah, it's good to be saved. It's good to take proper steps, but what's the next step beyond that? It's that vision of hope, that attitude that it is in God's will, in God's hands. Not just that we're going to save ourselves and put up a fence around our property and keep all those strangers away. Well, yes, we want to be prudent. But the other side of that is God expects us to be welcoming. God expects us to build up the kingdom. And so survival and prosperity are good things. Best thing is a feeling of joy in our creation. We may have material wealth. And our question today is, what about our spiritual wealth? Can we sing with utter joy, having nothing except God's call to us to be part of God's creation? May it be so.